welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 4. Today, I'm talking to Andrew Rains, a former professional racing driver. Andrew now runs Ep4, an American-based data analytics company. They are doing something quite different in this space, and I think you'll find this show absolutely fascinating. We talk about the product, but we also talk about data analysis in general. So whether you're a complete beginner or a seasoned pro, join us as we talk all things data and driver improvement. So welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
So the idea of this show really is to understand a little bit you as a driver, but also your product and Apex and how that's going to help, because a lot of people listening won't be aware of it or they won't know anything about it. So we talk around that. I've really enjoyed our conversations around the meaning behind why you're taking the decisions that you're taking in your product development, because they're really focused on making the life easier for the people who are using it at the other end. And you have a very strong voice within your product development team, and you're not an engineer. And that's unusual, I would say, compared to other companies who are providing data acquisition equipment. And as a result, it means that, you know, whilst your product is evolving and it will get better and it's got its quirks, the core reason why it is the way it is because you're trying to make life easier for people. And I think that value is something that people will be really interested to hear about.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like you said, my name's Andrew Rains. My business is Ep4, so we make a motorsports data acquisition hardware device. And there's a lot of things that are unique about it, but the closest thing to liken it to and why it's fundamentally kind of different than like a legacy data system is because it's kind of like an Internet of Things product, an IoT product. It's designed from the outset to connect to a mobile device and transmit data back to your phone. So it's a separate piece of hardware that's designed to go on the dash of your race car or your track car or whatever, you know, your minivan, whatever you drive on the racetrack, and transmit data back to your Apple smartphone. So that was how the design criteria from the beginning was a little different.
So there's no, just to clarify, so there's no SD cards, there's no laptops involved, there's none of that. It's literally going to your iPhone or iPad, I imagine.
Yeah. Any Apple iOS product that will run the latest iteration of the iOS software, which is iOS 13, will run the app. Yeah, so it's all the device that is recording that data, that's getting the data transmitted to it from the Ep4 hardware has to be in the car with it, and that's kind of your only limitation, if you will, for data logging. So it's all wireless. It's a Bluetooth connection, and that allows it to retrieve data.
So just to clarify, so it's not you using the phone sensors. You've got your own piece of hardware that is logging the data effectively, or sensing the data, and it's crudely sending that crudely in terms of crude explanation, sending that to the phone to be logged.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a separate piece of hardware. So think of the phone as more of the interface for how you view the data, sure. And the device that goes on the dash is the actual logging hardware that has accelerometers and GPS and stuff internal to it, because you can only do so much with your smartphone. Really, it's only basically a point to say, hey, I went to a racetrack and I have a little bit of data and maybe some video from your phone. That's for your first year of being on the track, somewhat adequate. But when you really want accurate information, you've got to get something that's designed to be in a race car, because it's a harsh environment. So that's fundamentally, the blend between, we were starting the business, I was using have used a variety of other of other data products. And so we kind of
So
recognize.
what's your background again for the benefit of the audience so that
Yeah.
they can understand a little bit, how you've got to being where you're at? Because I think you've done a bit of racing yourself, haven't you?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm from the U.S. If you can't tell from the exotic accent. But yeah, I grew up, living close to a racetrack and always wanting to be in motorsports as a kid. And by the time I was about 17 or so, I found some ways to kind of get into the sport. So I started with autocross, which I don't know if there's the same term in the UK or Europe.
We have the same term. I'm not sure it's the same activity. I don't think it's.
Yeah, this was like racing in a parking lot around cones, basically.
Oh no, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So started doing that and
in
drove
and out
a buddy
of
of
garages
mine.
and against the clock. A lot of forward, a lot of backwards, handbrake turns, and all that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah, all sorts of fun stuff. I drove my buddy's Honda Civic and I beat his time, and he'd been doing it for a couple of years. So I immediately was hooked. It's like, I have to do this. So I ended up my dad and I bought a project car to work on together as a track car. It was an Alfa Romeo 74 Alfa Romeo GTV, which was a very popular car around the world, in the 70s. And of course, it hardly ever ran. It was rusty. It fell apart at every race. So I got to learn all sorts of stuff about when you hit a curb, what breaks on an old race car, and what's like when you lose a head gasket and when the bottom end goes and stuff like that. So I learned a lot of mechanical sympathy early on, but I shortly thereafter went to college or university and did what's called Formula Student in the rest of the world. It's called Formula SAE in the US.
Yeah.
And got to be involved with building a race car from the ground up. So
which bits did you do?
So I did mostly just encouragement and team management, if you will. So I'm not a technical. My background is not technical. Have always grew up doing more of kind of like English history type things in school. Was always better at that. Always struggled more with the math and the science. So I tend to have more of the kind of creative brain than the analytical brain.
But I think we were talking about this just beforehand, and I think it's because it's baked into your product. The fact that most of the other competitors' products are coming from a position where they're technical experts and they're engineers and they're very scientific in their thinking, and because you're not like that, it's taking you down a particular route with the product style and benefit, which I think would be quite interesting for a lot of people who are listening. There's a lot of engineers listening, but equally there's also a lot of people who aren't that technical and maybe struggle with some of the data side of things. So I just think that's quite an interesting point to pick up on, and the fact that your background is not technical, yet you have a technical product.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been around it my whole life from the technical perspective. I worked for a shop in high school that did aftermarket performance modifications, and I've always been around the technical sides of the automotive world, but I always have been better with understanding people, and that's kind of been my skill set. So in college doing Formula SAE, they elected me to run the whole team my third year, because I got along with everybody, and most of the engineers would have sticking points with each other because, you got the Colin Chapman guy and the horsepower guy, that like have two different value systems for how the car should work, and they just butt heads. And I'm going, hey guys, we need both. Right. And so I also raised money with sponsorship and marketing and kind of trying to increase the provenance of the university's program so that we could get, more funding from the university by being more successful at these international competitions. And more successful for them was defined by engineers being hired by, big companies and having good, placement for the senior, the older members of the team. But then also outside companies wanted to appeal to our engineers and basically come in and do, like a sales pitch for hiring them.
Oh, like a milk round or something? They come into a milk round and try and like hire your engineers? Amazing.
So we would essentially charge them money to have access to our engineers and to associate. But, for a lot of businesses, like a company that does composites, they would have expired aerospace grade composites they couldn't use after, a certain deadline. And so they would give us $30,000 worth of composites as a write-off, as a tax write-off. So we were able to kind of leverage a lot of those relationships. And by the year that I left, I mean, our budget was like well over $250,000 US. It's just like this crazy. We autoclave. We had a full composite chassis that was where the engine was stressed.
What university is this?
Auburn University in Alabama.
There you go, guys. That's where you need to go and do your Formula student. That's amazing. Yeah.
It's pretty incredible. So we myself and one of the other guys that was there when I was there, we're both really we're both involved in motorsports as drivers, doing kind of our own thing, track days and club racing. And so we took the driving really seriously. So we could test at the local airport. And so I literally had a key to the airport where we could go in and test on this area, lay out our course. And if we gave them 24 hours of notice, they would close down the shorter runway. So there was 2 intersecting runways, and one of them was a long runway that had like the jet, any runway that's approved for jets has grooves for water runoff.
Yeah.
But for smaller airplanes, they don't have, the FAA doesn't have that requirement, the Federal Aviation Administration here in the US. So the runway we used wasn't grooved. So they would literally shut down this runway south of the intersection of the runways. And we would just set up this massive, autocross course where the top speed was like close to 100 miles per hour. So it was wicked fast. So we took the driving part of it really seriously. And because of that, because my interest was much more in the competitive side, most of the engineers just wanted to design an interesting car. And I'm going, guys, the key to having the budget to do whatever you want on the technical side is if we compete well. Because if we show well, the university's going to promote us, and that's going to get the snowball rolling, right?
Yeah, virtuous cycle, isn't it? Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So by having that focus, it kind of drove the whole program forward. And there were a lot of great people. Most of my friends went on to all work in NASCAR, IndyCar, big American motorsport institutions, for teams doing design work and all sorts of stuff. So we had a really good team of people. It wasn't just me by myself, but that was where I met my business partner, who I currently work with Apex Pro, and we kind of started the development of the product. He's extremely technical, so if you met him, you would understand why I can be the way I can be in this industry, because we have the balance. He's a PhD in mechanical engineering. Yeah. A very young PhD in mechanical engineering. He's an extremely smart person and just had kind of a vision of helping the drivers get more out of the car, instead of everybody else on the team was going, what else can we instrument to measure? And they're trying to get shock velocities, damper velocities. And we're going, guys, the drivers are driving the car at 80% of what it can do. And we're trying to decide how we want to valve our shocks. That's kind of not the low hanging fruit, right? That's the most expensive thing we could go after right now. So once we kind of realigned our priorities, and Austin, who's my business partner, kind of presented this idea of creating more of basically displaying the friction circle to the driver, but modified for more real world conditions than the friction circle typically displays.
For the benefit of the tape, when you and I were first introduced, this was an idea that I personally had and looked at a little while ago, a few years ago. So it was very interesting to hear your story and how you've been able to do that and visualize that friction circle to people, and in this terms of a score. And I just had so much admiration and congratulations for you guys to go from the idea to actually get a product into the market, which you've successfully done, and people are buying it and they love it. So this is sort of a hat tip acknowledgement to, well done, guys, because I personally know firsthand what it's like to go from, oh, that's a good idea as an engineer, oh, we have to do that, to actually having something that's polished and people can use and are getting value from. It's quite a long journey. It's not unfortunately, from an engineering point of view, you just think, oh, it's obvious, isn't it? You just go from here to here, but it's really not.
It's really not. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's totally different to build something that you benefit from yourself, or that your immediate group, peer group benefits from, to I can sell this to someone I've never met before. you have to be able to assume a lot of things, and usually with an engineering, heavily technical engineering project, because we had all these guys. I mean, the guys that I went to school with are now, a lot of them went to work for SpaceX, and Tesla, and one of them's now doing 3D printed rocket engines at this facility in Mississippi. It's like in the middle of nowhere, and they're 3D printing rocket engines, doing all this interesting space stuff. And he had all these really interesting ideas for products, but at the end of the day, they all, if you, me kind of having a little different of a perspective, not understanding necessarily the value of the tech, but understanding how a consumer would use it or how a business would use it. I was kind of able to ask a little more basic questions that were more fundamental to like the use case, instead of just, we can solve this really specific problem. So I think asking those questions early on with Apex Pro was probably the value that I contributed. There's certainly a lot of things that I had to learn on the technical side. To
the friction circle, for example, you just dropped that in there, but there was a point where you didn't know where that was, and I imagine there's a lot of people listening going, "I've heard about it, I couldn't really tell you what it was." Not because they just because they don't know yet. So tell us a bit about the friction circle and how your product uses that concept to basically tell the driver, give them some feedback.
Yeah, well, the friction circle can be defined in a lot of different ways, but if you're visualizing it right now at home and thinking about it, kind of just draw two intersecting lines, that are perpendicular to one another. And on one axis, you're going to measure the longitudinal acceleration of the car. So your forwards and backwards acceleration. So when you're on the gas and when you're on the brakes, the acceleration that's created by that. And that's going to be on the top and the bottom of that graph. And then lateral acceleration, which most of us are familiar with that term. That's cornering acceleration. So left and right turns, right? And that's what creates the view of the friction circle. What's really interesting is that I think the first guy credited with using it as a tool and a way to display something was Mark Donohue, who drove for Roger Penske back in the day. And I'm sure I don't know if that's a worldwide thing or if that's just people in the US that go, he was the man. That's what he did. But he's kind of the consummate engineer.
There's a lot of engineers who probably go, no, I thought of it, or something like that.
Oh, sure.
Because engineers are like that.
Yeah. And in all reality, we all haven't been around. It's like originality is kind of like it's like there's not as much value to original ideas a lot of times as we think. It's more about who communicates the value of it to the most people is kind of who's considered the originator of it. And I think Mark Donohue was kind of that person that was like, an XY plot, friction circle, traction circle, graph, whatever, GG plot, whatever you want to call it. This is what it looks like. So it's basically showing you kind of an ellipsis shape or kind of a heart shape of the accelerations of the car. And as a driver, your job is to basically, I call it bowing the friction circle, but you want to have the plots that are created by the accelerations basically expand as much as possible and create the most kind of circle looking shape on the friction circle that you can create. And that means that you're blending the friction circle, as in your technique is good. You're driving the tire at the limit, but the whole idea is to represent what the tire is experiencing and combined acceleration between longitudinal and lateral. And so what Apex does is it uses a 9-axis accelerometer to try to understand those changes, whether it's the track going downhill, the track going uphill, the track cambering in your favor, like a banked corner where you can load the car a lot more aggressively. And so basically it creates a real-time display that shows the friction circle, but it's modified based on those track conditions.
Like you say, I tried to explain this in a couple of articles recently, and the friction circle is basically a representation of grip, because what we want to measure is grip, but we can't. We can't measure the tire's grip, certainly not easily, and certainly not at a consumer level. We can't measure that, but what we can measure is acceleration. So the idea is that you use this friction circle concept to make an analogy for grip. And so what you're talking about there is the refinements to the fact that this friction circle is influenced by other things other than the grip of the tire, for example, the hill and stuff like
Absolutely.
that. So what you have done, which is very clever in the Apex Pro system, is you have tried to work all of that sort of stuff out, and you're literally presenting the grip of the car at any moment in time to the driver, and also showing the potential of what the car can do. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's represented by LEDs on the device, and basically if you're
really simple.
If you're at any very simple. If you're at any point on the track, let's say you're in a braking zone and there's red lights on the device, that means that the device has learned something about the car's potential, as in the grip potential, at that in similar conditions to what you're experiencing at that moment, that indicate that there's more braking force there, or there's more otherwise more potential of the tire. That's the best way to think about it, because when you start, grip is, like you said, it's almost impossible to measure. Certainly on a consumer level, there's people that do, things way, way more intensively. But when you really start looking at all the variables you need that influence grip, it's an infinite list, right? It's impossible.
It's a rabbit hole you don't want to go down.
You don't want to go down it. No, it's because it's like, well, you really need to determine the coefficient of friction at every point on the track and how the you can't do all that stuff. So, really simply, and when I tried to share with people the concept of Apex Pro, it really starts with the friction circle. And then it's kind of basically being able to visualize the friction circle in 3 dimensions. We use a 9-axis accelerometer. So the big thing that is interesting, and you mentioned this from a consumer perspective, is not very long ago, a 9-axis IMU, inertial measurement unit, and a compilation of accelerometers essentially that work in unison to create different types of acceleration measurements. They were really expensive and not micro-sized, not little tiny chips like they are now. So literally in the past 10 years, the ability for, just really refining, stuff that's been around for a while, but making accelerometers, chips, and everything smaller and more accessible was really the key to even allowing our product to have the computing power that it needs to exist. Because without the 9-axis IMU, it doesn't quite have it's a lot harder to interpolate. That is a technical word that I've learned.
Look at that. I thought I'd let you go away with that one. I thought I was just like, he's rolling with this now.
It just going with it.
It just comes naturally to it.
It does. I can talk technical enough for technical people to be happy with it, but it's not really my skill set. But it's harder to interpolate without having the 9-axis ability to measure that many different things. So, and the other thing the device does that's really interesting, that gets kind of technical, but is, if you're listening to this and you're an engineer and you want to understand how it works more, it's all about data filtering. We use some pretty extensive filters to determine, real, usable numbers.
The thought on that is whether your product passes the smell test or not. And the smell test is that kind of real world test of, you're driving around and you experience the same thing twice. Does your unit give you the same information twice? And if it doesn't, it starts to set alarm bells off in people's heads. And this is why it's so difficult to do what you guys are set out to do, which is effectively a simple concept of trying to visualize a friction circle. But when you actually get into the practicalities of how do I measure it on an ongoing basis, and how do I link, how do I cope with all these different variables that the car is experiencing? How do I make the number that's displayed to the driver consistent and repeatable and reliable, such that they believe it? Because if they don't believe it, it's going to be of no use to them whatsoever. And from what I understand, and certainly what I've heard, is that your system is very, very reliable and repeatable, such that people can go around and they are looking at really being able to use the lights and the way in which they show the grip and such that it can make a difference to their driving. And, throttling all the way back to a little bit earlier in the conversation, that's where this started, isn't it? You want to help improve the drivers from that 80%. You want to get 20%, as much of that 20% as you can out of the drivers before spending 4,000 or 5,000 pounds on a set of dampers that are going to give you 2%.
Exactly. It's the low hanging fruit, and all of our, all of us being drivers and racers, we all know that the human is the biggest variable, right? And it's the sooner we can admit that and focus on that, the more you'll be able to get out of those investments that you make in making your car faster, because you really have to calibrate yourself to be able to use more powerful tools, whether it's dampers, brakes, tires, or whatever. But to your point on the consistency of the display, first of all, I ran two of them next to each other in a recent race. Not really for much more
than just a good test.
Yeah. And what I thought was cool is they're like 3 feet apart from each other on the dash, and there's no discernible difference between what they're displaying, which is a good point of validation for me, because part of the software kind of has to have an understanding of where the center of gravity of the car is. So if it's in a different place on the dashboard, it has to basically make an assumption about how far it is from the center of gravity. And that's getting, Austin's the person to talk to about that.
You're off there. You're off. You want to talk technical. I'm trying to save you here, but you want to talk. You want to get into the detail. I love it.
It's interesting. It's like anything. You spend enough time doing something, and I don't think I'm technical, but when I talk to people about it, and they're like, "Oh man, you really understand this." And when I think about it, I'm like, "Well, I do spend every day trying to understand this stuff and explain it."
I'll tell you one thing. This is quite interesting. So so from a user point of view, though, it's really simple. Like they just turn it on, drive round, and the red lights show you how much grip you've got, and you haven't said it yet, but the green lights show you how much grip you're using.
Yep.
So from a user point of view, it's ridiculously simple. But the irony is, to make it that simple, behind the scenes, it's ridiculously complicated from an engineering point of view. And there's all sorts of stuff and decisions going on, and theories and physics and all this kind of crazy stuff going on in the background. But your customers don't have to worry about any of that, because it's just the lights, and the lights are reliable, and they just show you the grip, and it works in the wet and it works in the dry.
Yeah.
It's just there. And more than that, you haven't got to this bit yet. It gives you a score at the end of it. Like, you can compare across your mates and say, like, oh, well, you might be driving a faster car than me, but my score is better than you, so I was better than you at driving. I mean, you haven't mentioned that bit yet. I mean, this is just
right.
It's just
I know. I do get interested, and part of it's because I've been there for the development, so I've seen the challenges that we've had to overcome in order to make it. But like you said, to make a product that works for people, it has to be simple. And as soon as we got into the industry and started selling the product, we recognized that the use of the product was inherently simpler, as far as you don't have to wire it into the car. You can move it in between cars really easily. All you need is a phone. You just need an iPhone to use it. There's pretty low barriers to entry. It's not super expensive. There are all these things we didn't realize were our real competitive advantage. And the real competitive advantage is the whole thing, regardless of if it's the real-time display, the Apex score, the use. It's just it's easier. It's easier to use than what's out there. So that's really kind of what we've now focused on. And I think it's been really interesting, because the people that get into the product and the customer that we're trying to attract and cultivate, kind of like you mentioned earlier, they're the people that are looking at their own driving and looking inward and going, how can I improve myself? And why does the car do this when I give this input? Why do I see this? If I'm looking at data and I already know data, why do I see this in the data? Why is that happening? Because the display of the friction circle is really meant to be an inspiration to improve your technique. Because in reality, you have to do a lot more than just notice some lights on your dash and go, oh, I can improve there, right? That's the first step. Then there's a whole process of, if you don't know how to analyze data, you don't have experience with it, you've got to learn some of the basics of analyzing data, and then learning a little more, right?
Well, this is it, yeah. So, but again, we were talking about this the other day, is that one of the issues with the data isn't always knowing how to interpret it. It's just practically having the time, in a racing environment or in a track day environment or in one of these high performance, driving day things that you guys have in the States, just the practicalities of getting to a point where you come in and finish a session and then you're analyzing the data. If you're doing it on your own or you haven't got help, or even if you do have help, it's still, there's a kind of a window of time that it takes to go from having the data to not having, to having the data in front of you to actually start to do some analysis. And one of the nice things that I think, your product does as well, and as good as, by the sound of it, it's just kind of come out in the wash. You didn't necessarily intend it to happen, but it's brilliant in the sense that because it's logged on the phone, all your analysis software is on the phone as well, or on the iPad, and it's just there, and you can it's like straight away ready to analyze. So there's no mucking about with SD cards or other things like that. So you've got your score when you're driving around, you get your live feedback, and I think you've recently added the option for the lap delta time on the screen if you can mount the screen so you can see it as well. But into the analysis, like you say, it's like, yeah, okay, so I know how to do the analysis, but I never have time to do it in the day. Now, by the sound of it, I mean, your system is just like you press stop and the data is ready to analyze, yeah? Have I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely instantaneous because it relies on the phone. All that data is actually being sent to your phone while you're in the car. So every lap, all the data that's logged for that lap gets sent to the phone. So as soon as you press save, it's there. And I mean, even if you do I did an endurance race about a month ago, and I have 100 plus laps on a data session from a 2 or 3 hour stint in the car.
Wow, does that take up a lot of space?
It doesn't. It does not take up a lot of space relative to anything else. I mean, your standard track day session, call it 20 to 30 minutes, is less than an image, a picture on your phone. So it's a couple of megabytes.
Oh, wow.
Maybe 3 megabytes. A really big session's maybe 40. So it's the big sessions you can't send in an email, but almost every data session that you log on Apex Pro is small enough to format in an email.
So if I wanted to share, so let's just say, for example, we were running 2 cars and we were, the similar cars in a similar session, and we wanted to share and overlay our data together. Is that something that's easy to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's as easy as
that's quite a pain. Otherwise, you've got to take the card out of one and then the other one, and put the two together, and then sort of faff around with permissions and and load the data in, and then align everything up. I mean, how does it work with your system?
Yeah, it does, and you bring up a lot of personal pain points for me when you talk about SD cards and loading things into laptops, because I'm like the king of anything that I'm using that's not attached to me. I'm going to probably put it down somewhere and lose, especially while I'm at the track.
I just don't want to take my laptop to a racetrack. That's the thing. No. I just don't want to get it out in the tent when it's raining.
Right. And who does? Yeah. And, when I was pro racing, you had to take the SD card to the sanctioning body after every session. And I would lose the SD card every time. It's like, I can't keep up with that. I was trying to come up with a plan for the next session, make notes. And so the beauty of Apex Pro for me, and I think this is common with a lot of customers, is that, I take my phone, I either leave my phone in my pocket while I'm in the car, if I'm at a track event, or I put it in my phone mount. And then when I get out of the car, I just grab my phone and put it in my pocket. And I don't think about it. So my data is already with me, which levels the barrier is now gone to actually analyzing the data. And now it becomes more of, let me open it up and see what my lap times look like. Let me open it up and see what my Apex score looks like. And we want, principally at the end of the day, we want people to be excited to look at what is called data in our industry, but really it's more of a performance analysis of how did you do, right? And it starts when you press save on the phone. It gives you a summary of your best lap time, your best Apex score. So it kind of gives you some things to already get kind of excited about. If you set a new personal best, you want to go look at that data. So data is extremely valuable, and we just want to lower the barrier to entry to make it easier for everyone that's at the track to start reaping the benefits of data. So our goal is to make that first step into it really, really easy to take.
We talk about data, and there's obviously, because the system's not plumbed in, there's sort of limitations, I think, but I think you have some workarounds with, you've got an ABD module, I think. That I mean, have you got any plans? I put you on the spot here, but have you got any plans to sort of add a CAN input or something like that in the future? I mean, you don't have to tell us, don't answer, but the engineer in me goes, I just want more data.
Yeah. Well, I'll share internally, and what we think about is we only like to do stuff that we can do really well, because that offers the most value to the customer. So our background is not in interpreting CAN bus protocols. So although we'd like to do that tomorrow, it's probably more of a long-term project. But I will let you know that we are definitely developing another piece of hardware for the future. Indeterminate release dates. Stay tuned. Right? But it will have more functionality for more in-depth, analysis. But yeah, when customers reach out and we talk about, I try to offer as much consulting as possible, because I've used so many different data products, and you're in a position where you can kind of recommend specific things for, you're in the middle, you're not tied to one. But with me being, heavily associated with Apex Pro, I always try to represent the product in a way that I know will benefit, a customer. If someone comes to me though, and they're asking about, all they want to know is about CAN bus connections, and all they want to know is about stuff that is clearly not in line with what we offer, I try to tell them as honestly as possible that this might not be for you. You want to, what you're looking for when you look for our product is, reasonably priced, and then something that communicates easily and it's simple, and you want to learn how to harness the power of data. I'm really looking for people that have a mindset of, I want to be better.
But that's the driver. It's quite driver focused, I would say.
Yes, absolutely.
And yeah, and whilst there are channels that are, you could say, missing from a driver analysis point of view, for example, steering wheel angle, there are pseudo channels through looking at the acceleration traces that you can still imply those kind of inputs. So it's kind of driver focused. But the other thought, I've been talking to some other people as well, and they run the system in parallel, ironically, so they have, it's no longer, because the pricing is such that that combined with another system is still less than something else. Yeah. Having two systems running in parallel for the convenience is still worth it for those guys. So it's not. I guess from the purist point of view, it's not the way you would set out to do it, because you're running more kit on the car and that kind of thing. But at least, there's a lot of people who seem to take that as a valid option as well. I mean, it doesn't weigh much, I imagine.
No, it doesn't. It's it's not very heavy. It's very small. It's not going to be critical to your corner balancing, or your setup. No. But we do see that a lot, and most of the time it's because somebody already has a data system that either they've tried to become familiar with, and they're just not getting out of it what they want. So they want to try something else. And like you said, currently with Apex Pro, you're not going to be able to get steering position or brake input, which are both very important driver channels. But it's also, that's not because we chose to exclude those. Those are two of the hardest things to get, right? Pretty much anyone in the world of data can attest to that. Those are difficult channels to retrieve. You can get so much out of, and I'll share this with you, Samir, because it's what I've seen in the marketplaces. Most people that I interact with, and this is just, I think, just a byproduct of kind of, we always want to go faster, and a lot of times the easiest way to go faster is to improve our car. But most people that I talk to have to learn what the speed trace is. The speed trace being the speed versus distance graph, which is kind of the home base for all. Every pro race team in existence is going to have that as the top channel, right?
Well, this is my question. My actual question for you, which I've written down here, is because we're talking about Apex Pro. I love the concept. I love what you're doing about it. So I'll talk to you all day about it. But for people who maybe already have a system who aren't interested at the moment necessarily in buying your product, for them to still get value out of this conversation, what would it be if they do have data? What would be the first place that you would say they should be looking at when they have data? You pull up the data, you've got all these squiggly lines. It's a weird looking environment for many, many people. So where would you go first with those guys? What would you suggest is the best thing for them to do?
Yeah, excellent question. I love that question, because that's something that we try to offer too for people that are using other products as well. But I'm a big fan, based on my learning style and others that I know. I think it really helps to visualize data by looking at what you're familiar with, which for almost all of us is going to be a track map. So I always like to start with a satellite image of the track if you can get it in your system. Most systems do have a way of displaying that, but I just think that's kind of where you need to start. Maybe overlaying speed or longitudinal or lateral G over the track to understand this represents braking. Here's where I'm braking.
So you can anchor yourself in like, well, this part, this data exactly. is represented to that part of the track, and you can kind of
absolutely
dial yourself into it. Okay, yes.
Right. And the next step is relating the speed trace and where the car is on the track with where that is on the speed trace.
Yeah.
So that if you were to, in the future, just see the speed trace, you could kind of figure out what corner that is on that track. And, with most professional racers that you talk to, you can show them a speed trace and they'll tell you what track it is.
I was going to say, that's it. That's what happens, isn't it? That's what you end up learning, these stupid things. You look at a speed trace and you know what track it is. I mean, there's half the people listening to this are going, what? That's just like, that's so sad. But, that's just a geeky thing. That's when you do it enough, you just go, yeah, that's, whatever track.
But, learning the speed trace is so fundamental because it can clue you in. And I tend to, when I do data review and I help people kind of use their data, I focus a lot more on coaching from how can I self-coach and use this as a tool instead of just taking the analysis part. Like I want to translate it into an actionable thing. And so part of the process is looking at the speed trace and recognizing what's the first thing that you want to find. And the first thing for most drivers is a lot of us tend to release pressure off the throttle pedal while we're accelerating on a straightaway before a brake zone, right? We slowly release off the gas. That's extremely common. I mean, common amongst drivers that have been doing this for 10 years. And not realizing they're doing it because it's very hard to tell in the moment. But a lot of times it's because we've been taught and we hear talking to other drivers about a braking point. And we ask each other, hey, where are you braking? Which is not a great question to ask, because when you think about it mentally, if you go, I'm going to brake, there's a brake marker up there. It says 3, 2, 1. I'm going to brake at the 3. What happens with your right foot on the gas pedal is just before the 3, you start to prepare in your mind, I'm preparing to brake. It's easy to justify releasing the throttle. And in the speed trace, it's really easy to see that happening because it stops increasing. It starts to flatten out, right? It starts to become a little flatter at the top. And if all you know about data is to look at that speed trace and see if it flattens, and it does, then you stop. You don't have to go any further. I need to fix that, right? That's coaching. That's not... Right. And that's what really helps us progress as drivers, when we can start to learn some of those things and some of those tricks with.
I mean, I know this is a crazy question. Forgive me, it's a bit of a rubbish question, really. But how much lap time is data going to give someone? I hate myself for even asking it, to be honest, because I know it's such a rubbish question, but it's a kind of question that people looking at even like before they've even looked at data at all. The reason they're buying data is they want to go faster, and they measure speed in lap time. So, is it going to make any difference? I mean, it's a rhetorical question for me because I think it does, but we assume too often that it's just a given because you've seen the value out of it. But for someone who hasn't done it at all, what can they expect, really?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And of course, the answer is, well, it depends. But the main thing to understand is just buying a data system and putting it in the car is not what makes you faster. It's taking some of the lessons and applying them. So, what we see, I would say, if I had to average it out, and I have a pretty good sample size because of the drivers I've talked to, but very specifically, I went to an event at a track in the US called Road Atlanta, which is an awesome racetrack. It's near where I live. And we had 8 drivers that were there in this kind of focus group, if you will, of people that I was coaching. We were looking at data every session. And so we logged, their lap times throughout the whole weekend, and they all had maybe dabbled in data a little bit. or we provided an Apex Pro for them for the weekend. But the average lap time improvement we saw from doing, session debriefs with data, establishing goals based on what we saw for the next session, and kind of iterating and then sleeping on it overnight and coming back. By the end of the day, Sunday, the average person had increased by 2 seconds from their lap time earlier in the weekend. So that's probably the most, and like I said, it's really a coaching improvement. It's a self-coaching kind of, thing that you're telling yourself and how you're improving. But I think that's really normal. I think so often we get caught in the rut of doing the same thing because it's comfortable on the track, and data can help you break out of that.
Well, that's it. And there's 2 or 3 things there you picked out. There's the blending off the throttle at the end of the straight is not something you would think that you were doing consciously, because you're not consciously doing it, but you see it in the data. So that's an easy one to pick up. So that has value as well. It just makes you more aware that you're even doing it when you may or may not have thought you were doing it before. It gives you that constant record, objective record of what actually happened. I mean, quite often is you have a session and you get to the end of it and you can't remember all the laps, every corner, every lap, and this thing does. So that gives you a benefit. And then the other thing is to get those 2 seconds. I bet it wasn't 2 seconds in one spot. It was, say there were 8 corners or something. It's little nibbles in each of those 8 corners, and then suddenly you're 2 seconds. 2 seconds sounds like a lot of time, but it's you're just chipping away at each little bit, improving a general technique in terms of trail braking. I don't know whatever you were doing, but you can validate whether or not you've been successful at that in the data, and then you can relax about it. So yeah, you're doing that, great. Move on to the next thing. Absolutely.
That couldn't be truer. It's usually little chunks of time everywhere. And sometimes it's, more often than not, it's a misconception that us, and I say this when I say as a driver, these are all things that I've struggled with and overcome and still have to learn, because we all are facing the same challenges when we're driving. But it's things that you might just have a misconception about a corner, like how the approach, or your a lot of times, like we're taught from our instructors and people that influence our driving, that we should only focus on corner entry in a certain corner. But when you look at data and you see the distance, there are certain corners where you don't have much of an acceleration after the corner before you brake again, right? And in that instance, getting on the throttle early to exit the corner fast doesn't gain you as much as carrying more speed into the corner. So it's almost like there was one of the drivers that was at Road Atlanta. She saw a categorical improvement in lap time because that one corner where she was focused on slow in, fast out, I looked at it and I said, this is my experience with this corner. And this was turn 6 at Road Atlanta. If anyone's familiar with the track from iRacing or something like that, entry speed is all that matters. That is, you don't care when you get on the throttle. You want to hoof it into that corner.
That's another technical engineering term. Hoof in right. To the corner. Yeah,
hoof it in. And it was like a light bulb went off in her head that, oh, okay, this is being smart about our approach. And that's not saying take a huge risk there. That's just saying think about it differently, right? Yeah. Turn in earlier, carry more speed. Don't be as concerned about your exit from the corner. And that one corner was like a half second or more gain, So sometimes you do find those big chunks, but usually it's simply not because you cannot do it. It's usually because you didn't have a objective enough of a measurement to understand why you should do it differently.
And I think that's that you just nailed it there. You said I've had a half a second difference. So there you go, done. That's the lovely thing that data can provide when it's done well, is it really does validate those experiments, because basically you set up an experiment there for her. You said, I think you'd be better off rolling more speed in than you are. And she may have gone, no, I don't agree. And if you didn't have a way of measuring that, you're just always going to be like, she didn't get it, and he'll be like, and she might be like, he doesn't understand. And this is sort of objective measure that can just say, hey, you could have been wrong. Yeah, you could have been wrong. And she go, look, no, I was doing it better. And it's like, oh, yeah, fair enough. What I mean? You'd see it. And so that's how it can be successful. That's how data can be useful, when it's very, very applied.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be. Yeah, it doesn't have to be overly technical, right? You can focus on one or two kind of key things that you want to work on, and A lot of times you see stuff really simple, like some drivers don't have the confidence yet attacking the brake pedal. Using a lot of brake pressure initially, which is proper technique, right? Basically decelerate the car as quickly as possible at the initial application of the brakes, right at the beginning of the brake zone, and you can really, really easily measure that without having to spend a lot of time to learn how to measure it. It's really fairly straightforward, and it will transform your approach and what you've thought. How often do you either ride with somebody that is really fast, or have somebody that's really fast drive your car so you can quote unquote see what it can do? That's a common thing, at least here in the States. And what a lot of times needs to happen when you do that is either what you're kind of looking for is the confidence to know that the car can do more, and therefore your belief system now just, we're not everybody that goes out there is the Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher types where they're comfortable just absolutely pushing their own limits and challenging it every single lap, right? Most of us have something to lose if we crash our car. And so we need to know that. And that's what data is kind of helping us do. It's helping us say, hey, no, you can do this a little, you can be a little more assertive with your brake input here. You can be a little more aggressive with your throttle application. You can roll more entry speed, whatever it is. It's kind of helping validate our belief system, which is ultimately what makes us go faster.
So one of the things that people still need to do, though, is they need to take that raw trace, that speed channel and those acceleration channel data, and do some interpretation. So have you got some resources, or have you got any way in which people can do that if they're not familiar with it? I mean, whether they're using, forgive me, but whether they're using your system or not, these channels are pretty, by the time we get into this side, these channels are fairly standard. So
yeah,
there might be people who can get some value from some of the material that you put out there on helping interpret the data.
Sure. Yeah, the best resource from us is our YouTube channel. If you just search Apex Pro channel on YouTube, you'll find us. It's the Apex Pro logo. If you subscribe to that, you'll get notifications when we post new content. But we post a lot of stuff that just kind of shows the process of whether it's a video of me looking at somebody's data and just talking about what I'm seeing.
Do you do that sort of thing? Okay.
Yeah, we have a couple of videos. It's a series called I Spy that myself and a friend of mine named Eric Meyer do, and it's basically us just looking at some data and going, what do you see? What sticks out? How do we make decisions about that? And our differentiator, what makes us unique, is I think being focused on the driver only and translating data into actionable steps that you can go either fix an issue or try something new, or we're not necessarily here to tell you, hey, you need to adjust your shocks, not your sway bar, right? We might be able to back into that.
That's an anti-roll bar for anyone else in the world.
Yeah, anti-roll bars. I'm from the deep south in the U.S. where we got sway bars, track bars, painter bars, all sorts of bars.
Oh man, yeah.
NASCAR country.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, we say push instead of understeer down here.
Well, actually, on that one, there is actually a bit of that is more engineeringly accurate, I would say. Yeah. But then maybe that's a conversation for another day. But for me, I try to use push a bit more because it is more. I think
communicates it better to the driver. That's what you feel. The car's it's like someone is taking their hand behind the car and they're just pushing it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, apologies. It's just over there. For the people who don't know about this, I think hopefully it'll be an enlightening thing. I guess you've given us some links. I'll put some more links in the description for people to follow up and try and find you online. The product is clearly, you're trying to promote the product, but what I really like is the approach to promoting the product and trying to help people with their data and really have that awareness that, we're not all engineers. And even if we are engineers, we're in a rush. Those two elements combine to make, what you're trying to do great. So I really do wish you all the success with it.
Well, I appreciate it. I like what you do a lot as well. I've learned a lot from it, and I'm excited to do more. I think there's all sorts of cool stuff that will come from it because you have that technical background, but you also translate it very well.
That's very kind. It's flattering. It's just a flattery point in the show where he has to tell me nice things, otherwise I tell him off.
It's true.
No, that's great. Well, look, just thank you very much. As I say, I wish you all the best. I hope people have got some value out of it. Make sure, guys, that you go and look up Andrew's stuff online, and even if you don't want to use his system particularly, there's stuff there on interpreting data that I'm sure people will find really good, and recommend people having a look at that and trying to get some value. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Definitely. We're at apextrackcoach.com. You can find us there, and
that's the one thing. That is one thing that you do need to sort out. Like if you put in Apex Pro, it doesn't come up with your thing. You have to put it like Apex Pro Coach or something.
Yeah.
There's some other product that like a medical product or something that.
Yeah, there's lots of it. There's a golf club called an Apex Pro, and there's a keyboard called an Apex Pro. So yeah, it's which the golf clubs were around when we started. But there's not an Apex Pro in motorsports data. So that was the key. But yeah, if you're searching us or Googling us or looking us up on the internet, if you type in Apex Pro and then something to do with racing, Apex Pro, cars, motorsport, lap timer, coach, it'll come up.
Thank you very much. What a fascinating product. I really wish Andrew and the Apex team all the very best. I love what they're doing with their approach to data and the way in which they're taking that usability and customer focus and putting that right at the front of everything that they're trying to do. The convenience of having that access to data really quickly will be invaluable for possibly the majority of people listening to the show. If you get a chance, then check out their products in more detail. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.